Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. This is Hippie Hacker, and I'll be your host today for the SIG Architecture Conformance Subproject meeting. This meeting is governed by the CNCF and Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so be kind and use kind. Our agenda today, we've got a time box about 30 minutes at least before we go through the project board. And I'll start that out by going over the release blocking job. We have images that are building for the conformance for API Snoop in general, and these are post-submit jobs for prow.kates.io. They are to build the audit logger and the SnoopDB images, and we also have an app, but we need the SnoopDB images in order to create our prow job. And so if I can drop this into our chat area as well. I want to follow along at home. The hook seems to be missing from the CNCF API Snoop org into kates.prow.io, and I'm working with the SIG testing on call to try to make sure that the people with administrative privileges on the prow cluster are able to have temporarily administrative privileges on the CNCF API Snoop repo, and I granted that yesterday. So that looks like we're getting really close for this to merge. I'll also drop this into our chat. This is a goal we've been looking forward to for a really long time. This conformance gate for this prow job is intended to be a release blocking job. So rather than informing on a PR, when it adds new unconforming APIs, we're gonna go ahead and let stuff merge, but we're gonna notify SIG release and say, it's part of our policy to not allow this to be part of the release. Please coordinate and ensure that we don't use any, don't allow any GA endpoints that don't have conformance tests. And we're hoping that this will merge soon. I think if we go down to the bottom, we'll see that our tests are clean. We're just waiting for the approved and LGTM labels. And I'll open up the floor at this point because this is a really important issue, and I want to make sure that we are asking the right people for the LGTM, and also that the next step being to work with SIG release to make sure the processes are followed. I've jumped some notices in there, but not a super large amount of feedback yet. All right, I will move on forward from there. That's our release blocking job. The next part is we have some new endpoints introduced in 120. There is a KEP out for storage API for HA API servers, and part of that includes an internal, so I can find the exact link, internal API group, and this is an alpha endpoint. So as these new alpha endpoints are added, we'll end up getting new alpha endpoints showing up in API Snoop, and this is the alpha area. But if we change that from alpha, we just kind of back out from alpha and change this to stable, we'll see that whenever you have an introduction of a new API group, there will be a new get name of the API group, so the internal API service. So this is going to be inside of 120 a GA endpoint because of how the API server, as far as the way that we're looking at it, generates. So we'll need to add this likely to our list of unconforming endpoints. But I want us to try to follow along with the KEP so that it gets, so I think this is the KEP that we linked to earlier. So we'll have this list of ineligible endpoints so that it doesn't confuse. So is this one already here? Rion? Internal. Yeah, internal. So it's not eligible for conformance yet. And there's a link to why, because this KEP is still in alpha.
So just to be clear, that endpoint won't show up in clusters unless they have explicitly enabled the alpha API. So it isn't visible to anyone running a beta or GA cluster in any way.
One of our, I know this, and one of the things we've been trying to figure out over time is how to know from a static perspective and analysis of code what is optional or not. And in this case, this is part of why we have this list of ineligible endpoints, is trying to document why it's ineligible, whether it's optional or not. So we could update it to be optional, but it looks like it would actually be on track longer term to be conformant when that KEP gets all the way through to GA, because then API group would be there. So this is part of tracking that and keeping that connection with that SIG, so that we can ensure that our protocols are followed. We'll go back to the beginning. So I think our feedback on not eligible for conformance yet could also be, it's an optional endpoint for alpha APIs, to be super clear, so that it's better understood. Does anybody have any thoughts on a better wording for that?
I'm mostly trying to figure out how it showed up in that list, and if there's an automated way that alpha only API groups could automatically be categorized in the future, just to save toil.
Yeah. Zach, do you have that query handy that we can link to? I think it will be in the API Snoop repo itself. Check. Apps. SnoopDB. This org file will contain a lot of our queries. And if we're looking for ineligible, so ineligible endpoint, and we add this is the query. And so we would need to have some other logic around if we see get some type of API group and there is no content in GA, then we could automatically remove it from the list of eligible endpoints. For now, we're picking out specific endpoints because we have a link as to a reason why that doesn't exist yet, whether it's optional or not.
Okay.
Also, the reason why the endpoint shows up at all is because it's in the open API spec. We grab the spec from master in Kubernetes and use that to see all possible endpoints, and then filter out the ineligible ones.
Okay, it seems like if we're grabbing that spec rather than one from an actual conformance run, we should filter the endpoints that we pull out of that spec.
So right now, if you look at our load open API functions, we're pulling that from master. And so we would need to find a way to temporarily spin up, which I think if I look in the Kubernetes source code on how open API spec swagger.json is generated, it spins up an API server temporarily, does a curl, and dumps it to disk. So there may be some way for us to change and have a job that spins up an API server with the parameters to disable everything optional and use that as an optional, as a what's possible for conformance instead. because it's having this defined list of what's available. That's been our part of the digging through the data. Let me put a different. We'll put an action item here for research possibilities for depending on a Swagger JSON generated from a conformance run instead of master. Master branch. I think we'll run into some issues on, we depend on that for some of the top level things, but it might work good for conformance. I may swing back around. Any other thoughts there? I'll go ahead and move forward then. We're trying to get rid of our backlog of broken things. And so if we go back to what's available on 1.14, that is currently not tested. So I've dropped that link there. If we sort by tested release, we can see that a lot of these endpoints are picked up in 1.17 and eventually 1.19. But we have list coordinated lease for all namespaces, and also a lot of priority class related endpoints. And I think, Rian, you had some information on lease and priority class?
Yes, from lease, I actually found it belongs to Vucek's team, and they picked it up yesterday and created the test where we can discuss that in the second part when we look at the specifics of test that needs approval. Then about the other one is priority class. I'm still busy researching. Actually, there is 2 endpoints, the reading and create, I think, or create, and one other I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm still researching. So there is some endpoints in this group that's already hit. So I was thinking if there's anybody in the call that want to give us some feedback on that or want to pick it up and say it belongs to us, we want to have a look at it. So if not, I will reach out to the SIG, whoever it belongs to, that created the first endpoint test for this family. This is basically just asking some feedback, if there is any.
To be clear, Rian, you're asking for feedback on priority class and what did you connect to on that?
Yeah, if anybody have any comments on that. So that is one of the priorities for us to get those tested in this release. And if there's anyone in the call that can give us feedback on that, any suggestions about the way to test or not to test, or when it's not conformant. So I'm just throwing it out there to see if anybody wants to take a stab at this for us, comment-wise.
It'll usually fall back to us, but it's always nice to ask.
Okay. If there's no feedback, I'll do further research and I'll tie up with the relevant people in Slack. Not an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume that's SIG scheduling, but could be no. I think it's probably SIG scheduling. But I haven't really looked at that closely in a long time, so I don't have any comments.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, John. Yeah, as I get more information, I will start asking questions in Slack. Before we really put in any work in it, I thought if there's somebody that want to say, hold on, it's not conformant, there might be some reasons behind that I'm not aware of. So if there's nothing, it's not a bad thing. I'll do more research.
Thanks, Rian and John. We have pulled our test writing repository where we do all of our documenting and creating of tickets. So this folder on the API Snoop repo is just for our the way that we write tests in cluster to query the database and output the markdowns as the content of our tickets. It was a bit confusing having this mono repo where part of it is coordinating and getting the work approved while we have multiple people working on the issues together. Not much to do there unless you're actively working with the II team. But I think at some point it'd be interesting to follow up and have a getting started in this flow outside of our team. The next part is going through the performance board. And Rian, do we want to go? I see that John's there, and I want to make sure we make room for John. Let's time box this to 11 minutes so we have give John a full 30 if possible, and we'll let John move forward there. Our going through the board is on this link here that I just shared. In case you haven't done one before, all of the issues are over here, and these issues come from those org files inside the writing repo. And Rion is our bot that takes those outputted markdown files to include all of the SQL queries and Golang code that we try to get approved before we write the test, so that we don't get pushed back after we start. So if there's any way that we can get more people involved in the ticket triaging and prioritization, because we don't start working on it until after we go from triage and a sorted backlog and pull off the active backlog to activate that in turn create the other.
Okay, I will work off the list that we have of important issues, and that will also tie up them directly to the project board. What's not on the project board at the moment is, because I only got it just before the meeting, the add test for listing releases for all namespaces. As I said, Widget picked it up and they quickly updated. They did a complete lifecycle test for all the leased endpoints. This one just got missed, and I picked it up in API Snoop, reached out to them, and they quickly sorted it out. So there is it's got to approve. So I would appreciate an LGTM so we can get this off to kill some technical debt by their team. So if there's any takers for LGTM, that would be very good. Test that I want to talk about is the pod proxy and the node proxy. They are in the board under the progress column. And what we've done in the August 8th and September, August 11th and September 8th meetings, we discussed these, and because the proxy actually redirect, we were considering to push it out to ineligible for conformance. And in the meeting, it was decided that getting a 301 redirect would actually be sufficient to show that the endpoint is actually talking back. So Stephen went ahead and created the test for pod proxy and hitting all 7 endpoints. And then we, in a similar vein, went around now for node proxy. And then in this exactly the same method, we have under the triage column, we have service proxy. So there's been a lot of feedback in the ticket. So if there is any feedback in this meeting about how to proceed, whether we want to make some of it ineligible or only allow some of the endpoints. So yeah, Liggett, you have some ideas on this, do you?
I am.
Because from the way we wrote it, we actually rerun the test for pod proxy and node proxy 2 or 3 times already through all bugs sorted. So we think it should be good for our LGTM and approve. If there's any objections, I think we can go ahead with that. Then the next point is the write service status lifecycle test. We just recently, it was an old test that was approved a while back, but it fell to the back burner. So we rewrote it, and we'd like to have some feedback on the way we wrote the test. It would basically hit 3 service status endpoints. If there's any feedback on that, if we can go ahead and create the test for the pull request.
These are the 4 issues that we would love to get some feedback on. Would it be useful for us to go through and try to review those on a line-by-line basis? Or is there a better way for us to try to engage on feedback on these?
I mean, I'm not sure if you're asking for me, I think it's probably better for me to look at them offline. Like I am not familiar with any of these. I would have to go back and look at them.
Okay.
And I don't think it's worth everybody's time to watch gather context in my head.
Fair.
On the pod proxy ones, I think, I don't know if Jordan's on the call, but I don't know if he was trying to say anything or not. It's not clear. So he may be more familiar with those already. I know we did talk about those, but I haven't looked at the SIG call. So.
Thank you, John. I'll appreciate if you can go through, give us some feedback, and if possible, we can get them in. Do you think we can go ahead with the service status proxy or the service proxy in the same way? Create the test for the service proxy, because it's going to follow the exact setup. It's got kind of a duplication of the pod and the node.
If I recall, I'm completely going off the discussion we had a couple weeks ago. I haven't looked at this in detail at all, but like, yeah, I think that if they were returning a moved or something, and we just wanted to verify that's what.
Yeah, we were looking just to deprecate it because of possible client usage. But when we looked at the actual using the Kubernetes client, it actually does hit that 301 redirect and follows it as far as the current implementations. And we were saying, well, how do we need to test that at all? And we said, well, it is what is in use by current software, and it is a GA endpoint, and the behavior that it exhibits is a 301 redirect. So we just need to ensure that it is redirecting to the correct location.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. If somebody shipped a Kubernetes API server that didn't do that, it would break a lot of stuff. So yeah,
it would break a lot of stuff, and it's hairpinned. But I just wanted to make sure we revisited that before we wrap these up and try to push these through for adding those points to conformance.
So if we're talking about the GET request specifically, or GET and head request, then I agree that verifying the behavior makes sense. I don't agree that we should test and enforce that for all of the write requests. I think that is a bug that should be fixed in the server, since it will not actually work correctly. So if you look back at where the behavior was added and what it was addressing, it was to support browser-based GET requests redirecting and ending up at the right location. A post request that the API server intercepts and does not pass the post on to the backing pod, but instead sends a redirect to the client, which turns into a GET, will not work correctly. And the fact that this was added, the only reason this was added in the first place was to support an edge case GET request redirect.
Gotcha. So the action item here is to try to remove, pardon me, to remove the 301 redirects that would cause bugs in KK. That would reduce our number of possible actions against that endpoint. And on our side, reduce the number of stuff we're testing to get and head on those 3.
For the root with no trailing slash, yes. If you want to exercise the other verbs with a slash appended, that is a legitimate thing to exercise. That would actually pass the request through to the backing pod.
Okay.
I wouldn't object to exercising those verbs, but not on the root to trigger a 301. Yep.
All right. So not on root.
So
Go ahead.
what should be the appropriate status then on a post to the root without the slash? Just 400 or what?
I would expect it not supported.
Bad request or what? Is it actually not supported? Like a not
It's actually not supported. If you post to the root, we can't pass that through, and giving you a 301 that would turn it into a get is not correct. So,
yeah.
All right. We'll go through to create that PR or that issue, Jordan, and maybe make sure that what we articulated is what we've captured on this call, and go from there. And then we'll pull back to do stuff only on get and head, and not test the other verbs. I'm not sure if the other verbs support us. Or is it just limiting don't do patch?
it is verbs other than get on the root of the proxy subresource. That's the problematic combination. If you want to test the other verbs, appending some path, which would actually route the request to the pod, that is capability that should be tested. That would be fine to see.
Okay. Thanks for the discussion around that and the clarity that we were able to provide together on it. At this time, I want to make sure we make room for John's discussion.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Especially since we have, I think we have Brad here. They were interested. So if we can maybe click through, or actually if we can stop sharing, I love to share. Means I have to find that document. Sorry, too many tabs. So if you recall, we started the idea of potentially creating some profiles, but it wasn't as clear to everybody that we should be doing it. Wasn't as clear to everybody if we do it, what we should be doing. And so in response to those PRs, I just brain dumped the things, sort of the state as I see it. And there was a follow-up discussion which I wasn't present for, which brought up some other things. One with respect to, like, Brad's asking who's looking for this right now, or do we need it? Another was how we roll it out. If we add a profile, how do we roll it out in a way that's non-disruptive to vendors and users and everybody. This particular topic we've talked about since, well, it's been talked about since before I was involved with the conformance effort, and has gone in circles in my view of things. And I think that a big reason it's gone in circles is that we haven't really clearly stated or agreed on what purpose this would serve, and that essentially there's several different sets of stakeholders that have an interest in this idea of profiles, but may want them for different reasons. And in fact, more to the point, there's different stakeholders in conformance in general. And so in this document, what I really would like to have this discussion about and try to come to some conclusion if we can is, as a SIG architecture sub-project here, you know, what is the real reason? Who's our real stakeholders? So from a community, essentially, the short of this document is, or this part of the document is that, you know, the conformance exists for the community and for CNCF from that's those stakeholders' point of view to avoid fragmentation, right? It's to avoid there being a million different Kubernetes that don't work the same way and therefore damage the whole development of the ecosystem and the project as a whole. So that is kind of, that's those stakeholders. Now, if I'm a user, and I see this with users, this is what users think. Users think if a cluster is conformant, they can run whatever they want and it'll work the same way everywhere, which is, as we know in this group, utterly false because we have an extremely, concerningly weak set of tests, despite all the hard work that Hippie and his team have been doing for years. It's just really hard, right? And lots of progress being made, but even if we did all of the tests that are currently allowed to be in conformance, we would still be leaving a huge number of things on the table that that could cause really dramatic differences between different sets of Kubernetes or different distributions of Kubernetes and how they work. So from a user point of view, the program doesn't really do what users think it does. But in any case, from their point of view, yeah, they want workload portability, and I think we want that too in the community and as vendors. The shared set of stakeholders is the vendors, and the vendors have an interest in workload portability as well, and in lack of fragmentation as well. But you know, luckily it hasn't been a problem, but there's always the sort of risk in my mind of bad actors in the vendor community intentionally trying to subvert things. There's plenty of space for them to do that in the existing conformance program. And then vendors also have kind of a goal, like they want to get certified. They want to say they're certified Kubernetes and be able to put that badge on it. And economically, they're not incentivized to go much farther than that. And so that's another issue. One, that's why we have trouble getting, there's only a handful of vendors, a couple of vendors, like 3 or 4 vendors tops, who actually come in and actually contribute in this forum, you know, despite the 120 vendors out there or so. So I think that we haven't sort of figured out what is our real purpose of being. Which of those users is preeminent? Which of those stakeholders is preeminent? I would argue that it should be the community and the lack of fragmentation. It should be our top priority and our top goal. And I think that if others agree with me, I think that changes sometimes the flavor of how we would implement profiles. So I'll pause there for comments, and then I can talk a little bit about, well, I'll pause there for comments.
Well,
Any
yeah,
comments?
again, I think the big fear that some of us have with profiles is it's the easy out. It's the easy path. And sure, we want to get to profiles, but we want people to take the hard path, which is you found some tests, and instead of going to, ooh, let's go make this a profile, some of us would like us to go, well, no, let's just go ask everybody and see if that group of tests could for some reason go in the base, or how many of the, you know, this is what we did in March 2017. How many of the interested parties can implement those tests today, or how many of the interested parties think with a little bit of work they could get there? And that's what I call the hard path, because it forces us to make a discussion about, should we be raising the bar up and just getting those tests and increasing that in the baseline? Or do we really have a split? So I'm looking for the sweet spot of, we get to a split where half of the interested parties say they can implement something, no problem. Maybe it's all the cloud providers or something, and half say, oh no, that's a bridge too far. That's you can't ask me to do that. I run in these environments. And then you've got something interesting if you've got that 50-50 split, because now you can start thinking about, well, maybe I've got the first group of tests that goes in something that's a cloud provider profile or something like that. Because if those hard steps aren't done, we all know what's going to happen. Everybody wants to be an engineer, and they all want to have the joy of creating their own profile that they think is of value to them. But really, we need to understand if it's a value to the community by being a true profile, because we just can't get all the interested parties to agree it should be in the base. Or, like I said, that sweet spot that I keep looking for is a 50-50 split. Because if you're at 80%, we got to look around and say, hey, everybody, let's go look about having a timeline to get these into the base if we're at 80. And so it's kind of that process step that John, I always worry that, everybody's in such a joy, so there's that. And then there's what I'd call the true stakeholder, somebody who's showing up that's saying, I am so frustrated that these tests aren't getting into the base. Well, maybe we need to make them their own profile. So it hasn't been clear to me who is the roadblock that's keeping that group of tests to get into the base, and that's why we need a profile.
I see. So my concern there is I guess this gets back to like how broadly we want to make people conformant, right? So if I'm selling a distribution that's for edge, and therefore I want to assume that there are no persistent volumes, everything's ephemeral, right? Now, if you're saying that these persistent volume APIs, I must provide a persistent volume implementation in order to be conformant, then I can't be conformant. And so those are some of the deployment scenarios where and yes, we haven't done that work of going and talking to all 100 and some vendors to see whether they can support these different things. Maybe we should do that, but that seems there's areas we've intentionally left out of conformance because they require features that we don't expect will necessarily be available in all environments, or even that are features that are not sort of from their inception were not conceived as mandatory, like RBAC. I mean, you can run a cluster without RBAC, and today that's conformant. And do we want to tell people they must run RBAC? Now, here's where we get the confusion of the stakeholders, right? An individual cluster actually isn't conformant. A distribution is conformant, and this is part of the confusion. A distribution has to be capable of doing it. Every single cluster that the distribution creates doesn't need to be capable of doing it. It needs to be capable of producing a cluster that does support those APIs. So maybe, I don't know, that doesn't mean people have to ship an implementation, but if there's an edge deployment and it integrates with some on-prem CSI storage provisioning system, then it would need it. So
So the step of asking the group of representative vendors is an important one, because let's say it's only 10% can't do the persistent storage, and let's say it's only 10% that need the ephemeral. At that point, you wonder and you go, okay, well, maybe at the worst case, we've got two equivalence classes. We've got the edge, the ephemeral case, and then we got everybody else, right? Maybe worst case, or maybe it's just like, I mean, you really want to try and position this, John, in which case you end up with probably worst case scenario, two equivalence classes to keep the world simple, where one's going to be pretty much full function Kubernetes with the storage. My guess is pretty much everyone could support the RBAC, and that's why you want to ask the question. I could see two different, and these were the two classic examples we always talk about, RBAC and storage. RBAC, maybe you go ask everybody and they can just go implement it, fine. And the persistent storage is the one where we finally get the situation I described, a true split in the community that says 80% can implement, 20% can't, and those 20% says they're never going to get there. And in which case you're going to just say, well, we got a enterprise profile or whatever your favorite name is that captures the fully functional thing. And then you've got all the other folks that are playing around with the less thing. And then the question will be, well, did those lesser folks really need the certification anyway? Right? If they didn't, if they did, fine. But that's really you want to get to, which is a model that's trying to drive towards at most 2 equivalence classes, because if we really, really need this, let's apply some pressure and tension to the system that really causes folks to fit into one of those 2 camps. Yeah, I can support it now or in the near future, or yeah, I'm never going to be able to support that. You have no idea what my thing is. And if we get there, that's fine. And then we could clearly define the 2 profiles and people could understand those worlds. Hey, because for edge case, you've got edge conformance. That's great, but 98, maybe 80% of us aren't going to care about it. They can have their own conformance suite. That's fine.
Yeah.
The sweet spot's going to be that
I
80%.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I don't know that it's, I don't think it's just, I think there's other things, I can think of other things as well, but right.
But in one of the previous meetings, and I think Jordan was here for one of the previous meetings, we did come to the conclusion that we've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years, and it's pretty much those only 2 that have come up in 4 or 5 years. So the mysterious, hey, build it, and
Well, we have different, we've also talked about different classes of users. So can you be conforming, like as a user, sort of user level workloads, ordinary users that don't need to say modify the cluster composition either in nodes or webhooks or anything like that, right? So things that we would call admin level things where you're actually modifying the configuration of the cluster or adding nodes or labeling nodes, tainting nodes. That's a different class of users than those administrators. So if you're, this is where I get back to, it kind of depends on the stakeholder. If I'm a user, right, from a user perspective, all this stuff, what users hear when they hear certified Kubernetes is that my stuff will run out, right? And so the question is, it kind of depends on what that stuff is. And if I'm running a highly managed, like I think OpenShift, you get a namespace, you don't get a cluster, right? So is there a, in their online version, right? Is there a, and maybe Red Hat person correct me if I'm wrong, is there like a model, and is it appropriate for this group? This is the question. Is there a model for defining some set of tests, some set of parameters that says, hey, if you meet this level, then typical user workloads will work. And therefore, in this highly managed environment, it can actually meet that level. Whereas in, in an environment, yeah, that's all.
Yeah,
So,
and I agree with that. I think you would end up making more progress is if you, and just to use, somebody could come up with better terms, but let's say we could just drive towards 2 equivalence classes, light or heavy. And we look at the features and we figure out, can it go into the light class or the heavy class? So heavy class, you're talking about all those management functions, maybe, and enterprise features and persistent storage. And you start trying to mark them. Okay, well, we're going to do 2 equivalence classes, and let's go see which ones, let's try and push as much as we can into heavy and make it, as good as we can. And, or I'm sorry, let's push, what goes across light and heavy, but let's really find the things that separate the wheat from the chaff. Let's figure out those things where, you're going to have different groups that we'll call light, and maybe that's edge, and maybe that's non-management, and maybe it's RBAC not needed. And let's really figure out if we could find a way to create that equivalence class and figure out, because if you can boil this down into two things, you're going to be successful, right? And the classic model is, I don't even want to go to three. So the classic example is there was enterprise Java, right? J2EE, and then there was J2SE, and then there was J2 Micro, whatever the name was. I don't remember. But my guess, John, is you will be hugely successful if you push towards forcing all the vendors to say, hey, well, if you need to stay in the light group, well, that's pretty close to what we already have. And so don't get nervous. You'll be in, Kube Light. And then for the more ambitious folks, where we're really trying to get the more expressive Kubernetes, call that heavy. I would call it enterprise, but I think people would take offense to that term. So I'm just going to call it heavy. And let's go figure out what goes into heavy. I think if you break it into just two, I think people can then start making a decision, and it takes all the abstraction away, John. And then, because you could sell two.
Unfortunately, probably not as quite as easy. Essentially I tried to do that with base and privileged. It's just two, but you have an issue where, and Jordan would be one to raise this quickly, would be like, okay, look at extension points. Over the last couple of years, what we've said to people is, don't build stuff in tree. Build stuff using the extension points. But so that means that we need those extension points to really be part of the base. And some of those, in essence, require some level of privileges that we wouldn't necessarily presume an ordinary user has. So anybody else have any opinions on this, or any thoughts about what we're talking about?
Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think if I totally get the parallels with Java, and I see the way that makes sense. I think the challenge is that you'd end up with different vendors that had different subsets of heavy that would all be categorized under light. And then the problem you'd have is that it might start to become meaningless for users, right? So, we might say, okay, well, we pass light Kubernetes, and then some edge implementation or some cloud provider also passes light Kubernetes, but it doesn't really tell the user what it is they can expect that works or doesn't work in that environment. I think that's the challenge with it. I can give a specific example. From our use case is, we lock down specific things about the Kubernetes that we deploy in vSphere. So we lock down host network, we lock down node port, and there's a couple other things that we don't let users do because we want them to be able to run in a highly secure way. And for us to be able to say to users, okay, we are a conformant Kubernetes distribution, but we can't do X, Y, or Z, or we're not conformant, but you can't do X, Y, and Z. It's got to have meaning. It's got to have meaning for our users at the end of the day. But this is difficult because for us, that's a very specialized sort of use case. It's probably not something that everyone's going to want to do, but but how do we express that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think to add to that also, one of the things that Brad brought up in the discussion was, how do we work with environments that cannot conform at all, right? And if you think about different operating systems or different environments in which Kubernetes runs today, for example, there's lots of features in Kubernetes which are tightly coupled to Linux, right? Like host IPC, host port, host network. These are all essentially Linux features and Linux kernel features, which are part of conformance today. And if we do want to support Kubernetes on Windows and potentially other general purpose operating systems, the question becomes, how do we support vendors that want to do that?
Yeah, today, just to make it clear, yes. So if that was another profile that we talked about, having a Windows profile. So that's really about the behavior-specific nodes. So we have, and this gets into more discussion. It's in the document here, but we didn't really have time to cover it. Is there's a perception? There's two different ways to look at this, right? There's sort of at the control plane level. The APIs behave in the way I expect, and then there's another thing which is from the workload level. As a workload, the runtime environment I'm in looks like I expect. And there you've got downward API and things like that. And of course, Windows would fall into that latter category, and we don't really capture that in conformance today. Today, your cluster must have 2 Linux nodes in order to be conformant. And you can have as many Windows nodes as you want, but but we don't do anything with those. So in order to capture, in order to support pure Windows clusters, that seems unlikely to me, honestly, the level of effort involved. And if Microsoft's not interested in doing that, I don't think anybody else is going to put the effort in. But to provide some sort of conformance or user assurance for Windows nodes would be looking at a sort of runtime conformance type of program, which isn't this program today. And that kind of gets back to like, what is this program today? And is that what it should be? And is all this stuff we're talking about really makes sense in the context of that? And I'm still not getting, I sort of stated my opinion, which is that our primary goal and that the stakeholders to whom we are beholden is really the community and CNCF and the health of Kubernetes as something that does not fragment. I think that's our top priority. And those other things, what vendors want, how many vendors can meet it and can't meet it, whether users can know their workload will work, well, that kind of is related, but like our primary goal needs to be the lack of fragmentation, which makes me think we need to be careful to not make a watered down, like the light, just exactly what Ben was saying, I think it was, like, if it's too watered down, then everybody needs it, but everybody does other things on top of it that don't quite meet the big one. So I don't know, maybe it's just a subtle judgment call, and maybe like some of the stuff Brad's saying about how we make those judgments is the only path. I'm not hearing a lot that's moving me in one way or another, I guess.
So which do you think is the biggest thing that's missing out of conformance? My guess is it's the storage tests. So
storage is a huge one. There's also, I mean, you've got some like, you've got like load balancers, right? It's something people need, but it's not big like storage.
Okay, so what do you think about this approach? And I'm going to call this the cotton gin approach. And if you know how the old invention of the cotton gin was, you had the same kind of problem. You had all this cotton, but it's all bundled together like we got here, and we're never able to make progress. And what the cotton gin does is start pulling the cotton off whatever is there, right? So what if hypothetically, and I'm sure we can come up with a better name, because I'm not sure this is the appropriate name, but I'm just going to call it this until we get a better name. Let's just put a stake in the ground and say, we're going to go try and create what we think is the enterprise profile, which is, until we come up with a better name, call it the enterprise profile. That's more of a fully functional Kubernetes. And the first thing we're going to go try and add to it is more storage APIs. And we started just that simply and went around and said, okay, let's go find this, just like in March 2017, stakeholders or distros, we need a rep because we really need to know, can you support these APIs or not? And we tried as a baby step to create this new profile, for lack of a better name. I'm going to call it the enterprise profile because I've got that.
Full has no connotation of any deployment model, right?
What's that?
Full has no connotation of who the customers are, or what deployment model, or anything.
Right. So for giggles, I'm going to say enterprise because maybe I can get away with that. And we go shop around. Well, who can add the storage APIs? And we start that forcing function of let's go ask the distros, just like we did in March 2017. The reason we made progress in March 2017 is we were actively going to the vendors and saying, can you run these tests and see if your distro passes? And we legitimately made decisions based on that 80% heuristic of, well, 80% of the distros can run this, and the other 20% think they can get there. That was the process many years ago, John. And so if you're, and I sense your frustration that, hey, we're not making any progress. I see that as the first legitimate case that at least it takes away a lot of your problems, because if you're walking up with storage, everybody agrees that that's a real problem, not a hypothetical one. So you have all that built-in legitimacy, and we could just start going to the distros. Can you pass these 10 tests? So you, just like we did in the early days, you ran Sonoboy, and how did you do? And I remember IBM, we didn't pass them all at first, but we talked to our folks and we're like, yeah, we can get there on those last 8. So that to me turns us from a hypothetical conversation of designs, of profiles or whatever, to being a more process-driven approach to go after the low and most popular fruit, which is storage. Because then let's say you get success with storage, now we get to go after RBAC. And then after you get those 2 big ones, you'll start getting to a point where you're like, well, maybe it's load balancing. And then maybe after that, when you get to, well, there's some other ones, but maybe they're not so important, right? So my hypothesis is if we go after some big ones and show some progress, you'll feel a little better, John, that we're making progress.
That could be, yeah. We could actually do that. We're out of time almost, but we could actually, the first step would actually be to probably, given that there's like 100 plus of these, which is a lot more probably than there were in 2017, one thing we could do is build into the existing conformance tests a provisional set of tests that don't count towards conformance. But when people submit the results, then we get to see right there whether they pass or not. So.
And I would think storage would be the first good example of let's turn those into the provisional tests, because it's going to be real fun to see. It may turn out that you've got 90% right away with storage, and this becomes a mute issue, and you're just like, boom. Yeah. So that was the only way I could make a suggestion to get us out of this logjam, John, because I know you're frustrated, and it is a frustrating thing. But I can only just go based on history of what worked in 2017.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Sorry, Hippie, we used up all your time.
That is okay. I want to tell you both that we can support that effort when they submit the results. We currently do check that they have run these explicit set of tests. And if we want to enable more, we can just be sure that those show up, that they were successful in the PR for submission. So,
okay. Thank
great.
you.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. And John, if you'll upload that sometime this week, that would be great. And we'll see everybody in a couple of weeks.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Good meeting.